Mic check, test one, two. The Subcommittee on Domestic Policy of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will now come to order. The hearing will evaluate international supply reduction programs intended to stop the flow of illicit drugs into the United States. We'll be joined shortly by some of my other colleagues here, and I appreciate the cooperation of the minority staff in permitting us to proceed. Without objection, the chair and ranking minority member will have 5 minutes to make opening statements, followed by opening statements not to exceed 3 minutes by any other member who seeks recognition. And without objection, members and witnesses may have 5 legislative days to submit a written statement or extraneous materials for the record. Today, I want to welcome all of you who are here today and to let you know that I appreciate you taking the time to join us for this important discussion about the issue of supply reduction. The subcommittee continues its oversight of the Office of National Drug Control Policy by focusing on U.S. international counter-narcotics policies and programs. Over the last decade, international supply reduction efforts in source countries and transit zones have accounted for almost 40% of the federal spending on drug policy. Funding levels for international counter-narcotics were not always so high. Under the Bush administration, federal resources for supply reduction increased by over 60%. Interdiction spending alone increased over 100%. But despite acknowledgement from the current administration that international supply-side programs like crop eradication and interdiction have not been effective in reducing the availability of drugs in the United States, and the treatment and prevention are far more cost-effective, those programs are still being funded at significant levels. The President's drug control budget request for fiscal 2011 asks for $15.5 billion, of which $6 billion is slated for international support and interdiction. This hearing will scrutinize those spending decisions and evaluate what we've accomplished in this decade through supply reduction programs, both in terms of the national drug policy goal of reducing consumption in the U.S. and other foreign policy objectives. We'll hear from the Government Accountability Office, which will tell us that for all the money we spend on international counter-narcotics programs, there's been limited success in reducing the flow of drugs to the U.S., and we've done a poor job of ensuring that there are high-quality criteria to measure how useful and cost-effective these programs really are. This is consistent with what many drug policy experts have been saying for years. The evidence, after all, is stark. After spending billions of dollars on aerial crop spraying programs and efforts to interdict drugs, drug supply and consumption in the United States remain strong. The question we hope today's hearing will answer is, if international programs like eradication or interdiction simply cannot make much of a difference in U.S. drug consumption, then to what extent should we be continuing these costly programs? We cannot and we do not ignore legitimate national security concerns, and we must face squarely connections between the illicit drug trade and insurgents or terrorists. But such international policies and goals should not be confused with drug control policy in the United States. If the goals of these programs are, in fact, now justified on grounds of national security and helping stabilize democracy and rule of law abroad, then we need to evaluate whether and how U.S. counter-narcotics policy and dollars should play a role in those programs, if at all, and what role the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy should play as the leader in federal drug control policy. Our witnesses today will applaud some shifts we are seeing in international counter-narcotics efforts under this administration, de-emphasizing military and police aid and focusing more on strengthening civilian governance, justice, and economic opportunity. For the first time, the U.S. government is starting to consider anti-poverty programs and justice reform as part of its counter-narcotics efforts, recognizing that marginalized populations must have sufficient legal alternative livelihoods if we can hope that they will cease illegal crop cultivation and trafficking. But they will also caution that U.S. counter-narcotics programs are in danger of repeating the same mistakes we've made in the past and must undertake an honest assessment of the unintended negative consequences of these policies. For example, Mexico's efforts to crack down on drug trafficking is one factor generating a wave of horrifying killings. Our efforts in Afghanistan may be contributing to the insurgency by enriching the Taliban. Our work in Colombia, while successful in improving security, came with significant costs. Aerial spraying has grievously harmed the environment and punished impoverished farmers who have no other way to feed themselves. And the U.S. support of Colombian military's fight against guerrillas effectively underwrote extensive human rights violations that have gone unpunished. Those unintended consequences will be discussed at today's hearing as part of an effort to evaluate these counter-narcotics programs holistically. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for your attendance, thank the witnesses for their appearance here today. And now it's my privilege to recognize the ranking member of the committee and my partner in so many of these important hearings, Mr. Jordan Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for running a few minutes late. We were actually downstairs near the room. Thank you, Chairman Kucinich, for holding this important hearing today. Our nation continues to face a drug problem that takes lives, brings about violence, and tears apart communities and families. We need to take every opportunity, make every effort to eliminate this problem with an approach that focuses both on keeping drugs from entering the country and curbing addiction here at home. In the last decade, the United States spent over $20 billion to fight the war on drugs domestically and internationally. Winning the war on drugs is vital to the health and safety of Americans at home, and it is important to our national security. The threat surrounding the international drug trade, from the Taliban in Afghanistan to the violent cartels in Mexico, is real and has serious foreign policy implications. I'm pleased to see that ONDCP budget requests for 2011 increases both the international and interdiction components of the drug control budget. Support for the U.S. government's international eradication and interdiction efforts is an important part of the supply reduction strategy. Through eradication, interdiction, enforcement, and basic government support, we have seen some success, but we need to be certain that our international drug policies translate into reduced supply and ultimately reduced demand here at home. We know that drug trafficking has provided a means of funding terrorist and insurgent groups, some of which we are fighting abroad. However, there is some debate over how best to curtail these activities. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses today about which programs are working, which ones aren't, and how we can do the most good with the limited resources we have. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back before this microphone drives everyone crazy there.
I thank the gentleman for his presence here. As the days wind down in the House, there are many different things going on simultaneously, including markups. So I may need to briefly recess this hearing to run to a markup downstairs, which only for the purpose of voting. So I just want to kind of give everyone a heads up about that. I want to introduce our first panelist. Mr. Jess Ford is currently Director of International Affairs and Trade for the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. He joined GAO in 1973 and has worked extensively on national security and international affairs activities. He's managed GAO audits of the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department, DHS, and Department of Defense and other federal agencies. Mr. Ford, I want to thank you for appearing before our subcommittee. Now, one other thing about today, we're not supplied with a clock here. So that means your testimony will be timeless. But still 5 minutes. So if staff would kind of give me the heads up when it's 5, and I'll just wave or say something to indicate that it'd be good to wrap it up. But as you know, your entire statement will be included in the record, and it's much appreciated that you're here. Mr. Ford, I'd like you to know that it's customary for all witnesses who appear before the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform to be sworn in. before they testified. I'd ask that you would stand. Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony which you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you, sir. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. You may proceed, Mr. Ford. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, I'm pleased to be here today to discuss GAO's body of work on international and interdiction counter-narcotics activities. Over the last decade, we've issued over 20 reports covering a wide array of program activity in countries such as Colombia, Afghanistan, the transit zone, Mexico, Venezuela, and other key countries that are involved in international drug trafficking. Today I'm going to talk about 4 topics that I'd like to mention to the subcommittee. First, having to do with the issues related to the reported results of some of our programs. Secondly, I'm going to talk about factors that relate to our ability to judge the effectiveness of our programs. Third, I want to talk a little bit about the nexus between our counter-narcotics goals and our other foreign policy objectives. And fourthly, I'm going to discuss the difficulties in trying to measure the effectiveness of these programs. A key goal of the U.S. National Drug Control Strategy is to reduce illicit drug use in the United States. These programs are designed primarily in source countries such as Colombia and Afghanistan, as well as in transit countries such as Mexico, the Central America, and the Caribbean. They've included interdiction of maritime drug shipments on the high seas, support for foreign military and civilian institutions engaged in drug eradication, detection, and also the rule of law and alternative development programs, all of which are designed to affect the supply of drugs that are coming to the United States. GAO's work on these programs, I want to first talk about the first topic, which is really what the results have been reported. We have found that in Afghanistan, Colombia, and in the drug transit zones, the United States and its partner nations have only partially met targets that have been established to reduce drug supply. For example, we recently reported in Afghanistan that opium poppy eradication efforts consistently fell between targets established by the administration. While some Afghan provinces are now poppy-free, U.S. and Afghan opium poppy eradication strategy did not achieve its original goals of reducing the level of poppy in the country. In 2008, we reported that after 6 years, Plan Colombia had met some of its key goals in reducing poppy cultivation, but it had not achieved its goal for reducing coca crops. Most recently, the administration has reported additional reductions in the amount of potential cocaine that can be produced in Colombia, which suggests that the program has in fact achieved some of the original goals intended, although for a longer period of time than was originally established. We note that our interdiction goals to stop the flow of drugs, primarily through the transit area, we have not achieved any of those goals since 2007. My second point has to do with the factors that influence program effectiveness, and I'm going to just briefly touch on some of these. I think in the Q&A I can get into this in a little more detail. But the key issues that we find in our work that affect our ability to reduce the supply of illegal drugs, first and foremost, is the level of commitment and cooperation by our partners in influencing the effectiveness of these programs. In Colombia, we reported that over the years, the degree of political commitment and commitment on the part of the Colombian government was a major factor in our ability to reduce supplies in that country and to achieve some of the broader foreign policy goals, which I'll talk about later. Conversely, in other countries where we've had less levels of cooperation, such as in Venezuela, we're unable to effectively achieve some of our interdiction goals because the government there has not been cooperative with the U.S. government since 2005. Another factor that we frequently identified in our work has to do with the level of sustainment that our programs have had, particularly in places in the transit zone and in Central America, where we've provided resources intended to enhance the capacity of those countries to interdict drugs, but the programs themselves, due to lack of sustainment, have not achieved their intended objectives. The third area that I'd like to comment on has to do with the nexus between our counter-narcotics programs and other foreign policy objectives. Currently, in places such as Colombia and Afghanistan, much of our programs there, our counter-narcotics programs, are part of our broader foreign policy objectives to deal with, in the case of Afghanistan, our counterinsurgency problem, and in the case of Colombia, to deal with the problems of security with the FARC and other illegal groups there. And that in trying, and I'm going to get to this in a minute, but in trying to assess effectiveness, we find that this overlap between counter-narcotics and foreign policy goals is problematic in trying to assess the overall effectiveness. Okay, finally, the last point I would like to make has to do with the difficulties in trying to measure the overall effectiveness of these programs. We have found in many of our reports that U.S. agencies lack reliable performance measurement and results information to really judge whether or not we are having a major impact in reducing the supplies and flow of drugs to the United States. An example, in Afghanistan, we found that opium eradication measures were not sufficient for assessing overall U.S. efforts. We also reported that the State Department in the transit area was not able to measure more than half of their programs intended to reduce the flow of drugs. And this morning we are issuing a new report on the Department of Defense efforts to enhance their performance system, and our findings are that the DoD still has not got an effective performance measurement system that enables one to determine whether or not their programs are achieving their intended results. I'm not going to get into all the recommendations we made. I can just say that for the 20 products that I mentioned, we had several recommendations designed to address many of these shortcomings, and in most cases, the administration, the agencies that we dealt with, agreed with our recommendations, and they have taken action. With that, I think I'm going to close, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ford. You know, I'm looking at the report, and just like to piece together some of the comments that the statements that are in this report. You talk about factors that limit program effectiveness, including external factors in partner nations that relate to corruption or lack of political support. Then the report goes on to talk about a lack of political will on the part of Afghan central and provincial governments. And then you also, in a section on limited cooperation between the United States and partner nations, talk about the objections of Afghan officials to certain eradication efforts, and them being slow to grant permission to eradicate poppy fields. Let's talk to this subcommittee a moment about the effect of corruption in Afghan central government and the impediment that presents for the eradication of drugs in Afghanistan, or the eradication of these drug crops in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, our report issued in March, we discussed the problems that our program implementers have had in trying to get cooperation with elements of the Afghan government. And the program at that time was being administered at the provincial level, where the governors of various provinces were our partners, and our ability to get them to support our eradication efforts varied from one place to another. And in some cases, they were unwilling to partner with us and take the actions that were necessary to help achieve the eradication goals. That's one of the key reasons why we didn't achieve those goals. We also developed a...
Is it also one of the reasons why production seems to go up?
Well, certainly, if we're not able to eliminate the crop, I mean, if the crop's
mean,
not
production's
not
gone up.
eliminated, then obviously
Production's
production will
gone
go
up
up.
substantially.
The level of production in Afghanistan, I don't have the exact numbers, I can supply them for the record, but my understanding is that they've gone up in some provinces they've gone up, in other provinces the level of poppy cultivation has actually gone down. So it varies what part of the country you're in, but all in southern part of Afghanistan is where most of the poppy is currently being cultivated. That's the main problem area that we're trying to address.
And how much of an increase has there been there?
Again, I don't have the numbers here in front of me, but I can supply them for the record.
Well, your report states that since 2006, cocaine removal rates from interdiction have declined and have not reached any of the annual targets to date. It also states that long-term gains in crop eradication are difficult because of countermeasures and shifts in production. Yet we spend billions of dollars a year on expensive interdiction and crop eradication efforts. Is there currently any data that would allow for a cost-effective analysis of supply reduction programs like crop eradication or interdiction and reducing supply of illicit drugs?
Okay, let me just clarify. Are you asking just about Afghanistan or in general?
Generally.
Okay. We have not, I have not seen any cost-effectiveness analysis directly related to your question, related to either supply reduction or interdiction in terms of how it affects consumption in the United States. The Office of National Drug Control Policy has reports lots of different data on levels of consumption in the United States based on surveys that it takes, but I have not seen any analysis that shows a correlation between the supply reduction effort and the interdiction effort. And we in GAO have not studied that in any detail.
Well, yeah, it's troubling that there's an absence of useful metrics to measure success of supply reduction programs, especially when we're spending billions of dollars a year. One of the principal goals of this subcommittee is to enhance and improve upon ONDCP's role in collecting and analyze data to ensure we create drug policy based on what works and knowing what doesn't work. One drug policy researcher has estimated that while the U.S. spends 60% of our budget on supply reduction, supply-side agencies spend only about 5 to 10% of the total drug policy research budget. Based on GAO's work, do you agree with this assessment that enforcement agencies are not adequately oriented towards data collection, research, and analysis that would conceivably improve programming?
We certainly think that that research and collecting good data on these problems is certainly needed. I mean, one of our major findings, as I mentioned earlier, from most of our work is that we don't have good performance metrics and we don't have good data that supports them to enable one to make good decisions about what course of action we should be taking. So that is a fundamental problem that we've seen throughout the 10 years we've been studying this.
Just a follow-up before Mr. Jordan asks questions. What types of assessment and program planning tools are needed by U.S. agencies to effectively assess counter-narcotics efforts, and are you aware of any of these agencies currently working to improve their metrics?
Okay, well, first of all, on the Department of Defense, the report that we're issuing today, we comment on the performance measurement system that DoD has in place. We're critical of that system. DoD is currently in the process of revising their performance measurement system. They've been working on that for several months. Our big concern really having to do with DoD is that we don't believe they can currently tell anyone exactly to what extent they're able to carry out their mission in terms of what works and what doesn't work, because they don't have a good way of assessing the performance of their program elements. Moreover, our report also shows we talked to many of their client organizations, and we found that many of them aren't using the performance system that's in place now. So they need to do two things. They need to first improve the system, and number two is they got to get their the commands that are carrying out the programs to use it as a tool for making the right kind of decisions. Those are the two things that we recommended in that report.
Thank you. Mr. Jordan, why don't you take seven minutes if you want.
No, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me just pick up, Mr. Ford, where the chairman was. Of the $1.5 billion DoD spent last year, how much of that money was marked for assessment and measuring the effectiveness or lack of effectiveness of the program? Do you know that?
I do not know that. I do not know how much money they spent for performance measurement.
Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, that would certainly be a place to start when we're trying to figure out how to measure this. We can't even tell how much money they allocated for that. That's an indication that it's not working the way we want it to. In your comments, Mr. Ford, let's go to Plan Columbia. I believe you said on Plan Columbia that it had met some of its goals, but not relative to coca crops. How far off were those? How far off were they from meeting their goals there?
Okay, well, I need to kind of explain. We issued a report in 2008.
Mm-hmm.
The original goal of Plan Columbia was to reduce, one of the original goals, excuse me, was to reduce coca cultivation by 50% using 2000 as a baseline. Our report in 2008, in 6 years, showed that after 6 years we did not achieve that goal. We did achieve that goal for poppy eradication, which was in our report. Since that time, we've seen some new data that ONDCP has put out that shows that the level of potential coca production has declined fairly significantly in 2008. So if you, over an 8-year period, you could argue they met the goal, but during the original goal, they didn't achieve it. And that's what our report said in 2008.
And is the failure to meet this goal, is this back to, I think, what the chairman's questioning, what do you attribute that to? Is it the lack of cooperation from local authorities, or elaborate if you would?
Okay, well, I think it's a little bit difficult to answer that question because part of this has to do with the way we survey what the potential is in that country. And when we started the program in 2000, the methodology that was used to determine what the potential coca cultivation level was and what the potential production was different. It changed in 2004 and 5. The CIA, who does these surveys, changed their methodology. So that came up with different results. So part of the problem was what denominator you use to try to judge that success level. Mm-hmm. So some part of it is what I would call a methodological challenge on a part of our government to determine what exactly exists there, what can be produced, and what the potential is for these drugs to come to the United States. So part of it is that. Then as far as the actual implementation of the program, you have to look at it over time. I think our work in the early years of Plan Columbia, we identified lots of problems with the way our government was implementing the program in partnership with the Colombian government. Over time, I would say that relationship improved fairly significantly, and that probably had a positive impact in the ability for us to eradicate some of those crops. But I don't think necessarily you can establish a causal relationship between all of those various efforts and the current outcome. I think we need to look at what the trend will be over the next several years to see if it really did have a meaningful impact.
Let's go back to this measurement and assessment concern, kind of in a broad category here. Why has the State Department not reported outcome-related information for over half of its major drug countries?
Okay, that work is based on a report we did on the transit areas. This is primarily in Central America,
right,
in the Caribbean. And that work we identified, the State Department had identified a number of performance indicators, but they just hadn't matched them together with reasonable results. So you couldn't tell, they had an indicator that said we're going to train 50 police officers in Guatemala. But what they didn't say was whether or not that was, those officers in turn would be used to address the counter-narcotics problem versus just fighting crime in general. Those kind of things weren't identified in their reports. And so for us, it was difficult to show what are the real results of this effort. We see that a lot, by the way. Often the administration will have these indicators, like we trained a certain number of people. We added 5 pieces of new inspection equipment on the border, but we don't relink that to what are the outcomes of that. I mean, what are we getting for it? Are we seizing more drugs? Are we reducing the crime levels? Is the level of violence going down? Those kind of things we haven't typically seen in many of these systems we use to measure our programs.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I'm going to go to one more round of questions of Mr. Ford. New York Times is reporting that GAO's Merida Initiative report being released this afternoon found that the State Department has failed to set specific targets to determine whether the money was having the desired effect of disrupting organized crime groups and reforming law enforcement agencies. Is this an accurate summary of your findings with respect to Mexico?
I can tell you that, the report hasn't been released yet, so I'm not quite sure where the New York Times got that information, but I can tell you that we are going to be reporting that performance measurement is a challenge, absolutely.
Let's talk about Afghanistan. In March 2010, the GAO report evaluating the U.S. strategy to combat drugs in Afghanistan, one of the key points was that insufficient mechanisms were in place to evaluate the counter-narcotics strategy's justice reform pillar. To what extent is this deficiency specifically for Afghanistan or of U.S. counter-narcotics policy broadly? And is this also true in Mexico?
Yeah, I can tell you that our work looking at judicial reform, which is usually an element of our counter-narcotics or security strategy in many of these countries, that our work over the years has shown that the administration has not done a very good job of measuring the impact. Again, it just gets into a case of we trained X number of prosecutors, that type of thing, which gives you some information but doesn't really tell you whether or not real reform in the country is occurring or not. The other thing, our work in Colombia, our work in Afghanistan shows that changing the judicial system in these countries takes years. We're attempting, in the case of Colombia, we attempted to have them change their prosecuting system to an accusatorial system similar to what we have in our country. That's taken years for them to put that in place. They have, my understanding is, they do have it in place now, but it was a long-term effort. We're trying to do that in Mexico. It's at the early stages, so I don't think we have any information to indicate whether it's having any impact. But the bottom line is those kind of programs are one of the key areas where we don't see very good performance information to tell you what the results are.
One final question. Your testimony states that counter-narcotics related programs often advance broad foreign policy objectives. And you cited Afghanistan as an example where the United States has combined counter-narcotics efforts with military operations to combat insurgents as well as drug traffickers. But isn't there also evidence that prior to the administration's decision to stop forced crop eradication, the counter-narcotics programs actually hindered rather than advanced foreign policy goals of stabilizing the country? Are there other examples where counter-narcotics have actually undermined other foreign policy goals?
Okay, well, with regard to Afghanistan, obviously the administration's changed its strategy there. And one of the rationales they've used is the one that you just articulated, that they felt that the eradication program was a negative influence on our counterinsurgency effort there. Now that the new strategy is to focus more on interdiction.
What do you think?
In terms of whether or not that's going to work or not?
Right.
I don't think there's any basis for us to say whether it will work or not at this point, because they just changed the strategy within the last year.
Based on your evaluation, though, of these programs in the past, do you have any informed opinion that you'd like to share with the subcommittee?
Well, I don't have an independent opinion of whether that policy was working or not. We said in the report their eradication goals were never achieved from 2005 to 2009. So for that 4-year period, the data would suggest we weren't achieving those goals. Whether we didn't say it was contrary, that policy was contrary to our counterinsurgency goals. We didn't make an evaluation of whether that was a wrong policy to implement that program.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Mr. Jordan.
Yeah, just one question, and this may be more appropriate for Mr. Kurlikowski in the next panel. But is there an effort across government agencies to put in place, and the chairman was getting in this in his first round as well, a consistent way to measure how we're doing, to measure success or lack of?
I'll tell you what I know. It's my understanding that ONDCP is currently actually assessing the whole dynamic of how to measure performance. I don't know much about the details of what they're doing. I've talked to some of their staff, and they've indicated they're revisiting this whole concept, but I just don't know what they're going to be doing on it.
Have you looked at, has GAO done anything, and I probably should know this, but on the other side, the success of treatment programs, have you, and measurements we have there, have you looked at some of that as well?
To my knowledge, GAO has not looked at that extensively recently. The part of GAO that would normally do that work, my understanding is the last time they looked at this issue was at least 10 years ago. So
Really?
I'm not aware we've done any major significant work on treatment. However,
Do you happen to know
however, I
how
will
much, do
go
you happen to
back, for the record, I'll go back and check just to make
okay,
sure that
do you
I'm
happen
right
to know,
on this.
do you happen to know how much money we've, taxpayers have put into treatment programs?
I don't have that number in front of me. I know that is in the ONDCP budget announcement, but I don't have the exact amount in front of me, so I can't estimate what number that is.
Yeah, but certainly something we should be measuring and find out how we're doing.
I would
Is that
agree
a
with
yes?
that. I would agree with that. I think all aspects of our drug program should be evaluated. I agree with that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Ford, the subcommittee will have some follow-up questions to present to you in the next few days.
Okay.
But we appreciate your presence there and your service to our country.
Thank you, sir.
You're dismissed as a witness, and we're going to call the next panel. I will introduce the next panel as our staffer helps to prepare this table for their testimony. Mr. Gil Kurlikowski is the Director of National Drug Control Policy. Mr. Kurlikowski brings nearly 4 decades of law enforcement and drug policy experience to the position, most recently serving 9 years as the Chief of Police for the Seattle Police Department. He also served as Deputy Director for the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services. Ambassador David Johnson has served as the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs at the State Department since October of 2007. In addition to numerous other distinguished posts within the federal government, Mr. Johnson served as Afghan Coordinator for the United States from May 2003 to July, from May 2002 to July 2003. And finally, on this panel, William Wexler is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Counternarcotics and Global Threats. In that capacity, he leads the department's counter-narcotics and policies and operations around the world. Mr. Wexler has previously served as Special Advisor to the Secretary of the Treasury and on the staff of the National Security Council. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here. Your service to our nation is duly noted and appreciated. It is the policy of our Committee on Government Oversight and Reform to swear in all witnesses before they testify. I'd ask that you raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony that you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses answered in the affirmative. As with the gentleman on the first panel, we ask that each witness give an oral summary of your testimony. Keep in mind that your entire statement will be included in the record of the hearing, and we ask that you try to keep it to 5 minutes in duration. Director Kurlikowski, let's begin with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Kucinich and Ranking Member Jordan, distinguished members of the committee that I look forward to answering all of their questions in just a few minutes. I'm happy to discuss ONDCP's National Drug Control Strategy, which, as the Chairman knows, was not available at our last hearing, but has since been released by President Obama from the Oval Office. It is a comprehensive drug strategy that includes prevention, treatment, domestic enforcement, and recognizes the importance of interdiction cooperation with partner nations to reduce the supply of illicit drugs. You've asked us to focus on the international supply reduction programs and interdiction, which together constitute, as you mentioned, about 40% of the annual drug control budget. And these programs benefit the United States as well as our foreign partners, and our efforts against drug trafficking organizations reduce the supply of drugs available on American streets, while our allies increase their own capacity to resist the crime, violence, and corrupting influence of drug production and trafficking. This partnership to promote the rule of law and strengthen democratic institutions while dismantling drug cartels not only reduces domestic drug availability, it helps to achieve broader national security objectives. The international narcotics programs present a toolkit of initiatives, and these tools include interdiction, eradication, extradition, economic development assistance, institutional capacity building, law enforcement, human rights, judicial training, and international demand reduction assistance. How these tools are used depends in particular on the drug challenge, the available resources, the current capabilities, and the political will found in respective host nations. And where we have a strong and sustained commitment from elected leaders, such as in Colombia, the United States support can significantly strengthen the nation's security, human rights, and economic environment while reducing drug production. The globalized illicit drug trade requires collaborative solutions. The traffickers do not respect any borders. Both Colombia and Mexico have benefited from the brave and decisive leaders who insist on bringing traffickers to justice and regaining full control of their countries. The United States must continue to provide direct assistance to these two nations, as well as forge other partnerships in the Western Hemisphere, the European Union, the Federation of Russia, and Afghanistan as they address their respective drug challenges. Multilateral collaboration is another fundamental part of our international efforts. I had the opportunity to lead the United States delegation this year to the United Nations Commission on Narcotics drug meeting in Vienna, where we presented our policies on drug driving, access to treatment, and achieved approval of United States resolutions on community-based prevention and prescription drugs. And throughout the year, the United States agencies work with these international organizations, such as the UN and OAS, to address drug trafficking, money laundering, precursor chemical division, and to promote institution building, law enforcement, and international demand reduction programs. These international efforts have resulted in some significant accomplishments, and in June, I joined UNODC Executive Director Antonio Costa and the Russian Director of their drug czar, Chairman Ivanov, for the release of the United Nations 2010 World Drug Report. And the report highlights the recent significant decline in cocaine consumption in the United States. The conclusions of this report correspond with the progress reported in multiple domestic data sets, such as declining cocaine prevalence found in the surveys of youth, adults, and arrestees, as well as law enforcement reporting on the drop in purity and the rising price per pure gram of cocaine on U.S. streets since 2006. Now, it's difficult to prove direct cause and effect, and I believe it's noteworthy that multiple U.S. drug indicators reflect positive domestic changes concurrently with a 43% decline in cocaine production in Colombia between 2006 and 2008. And cocaine provides a good example of how our international efforts work. Nevertheless, we must continually adjust and fine-tune our mix of programs. In fact, we're doing a performance reporting system that Mr. Ford just referred to. We are displeased and unhappy with the performance metrics that are out there, and the President's drug control strategy has devoted an entire chapter to working on improving the domestic measures and also improving the quality of the measures internationally. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Johnson, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Jordan, members of the subcommittee, I'm grateful for the opportunity today to testify about the State Department's foreign assistance programs that seek to diminish counter-narcotics production and trafficking abroad and combat the illicit networks with which they are linked. Drug trafficking organizations show time and again that they have neither decency nor respect for the law and certainly no respect for human life. Cartels and traffickers demonstrate every day their only motive is profit. and profit they do, often overwhelming or circumventing the capacity of government resources to shut them down and corrupting public officials who stand in their way. This undermines public security, weakens democratic principles and institutions, and if left unchecked, provides a fertile breeding ground for the instability that can threaten our own national security here at home. That's where we at the State Department come in. As the Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, much of the work that the team I lead does involves foreign assistance programs that give our foreign partners the tools to isolate and disrupt drug trafficking organizations abroad. Our programs directly impact and improve foreign government capacity, building a platform for joint work between our foreign partners and American law enforcement agencies. Our primary focus is to improve the criminal justice sectors, police, prosecutors, courts, and corrections of foreign governments, so that they can confront threats directly on their own home turf before those threats can reach our own borders. In key drug source countries, States' assistance has disrupted drug trafficking operations and organizations in Colombia, weaned farmers away from drug crops in Afghanistan, and educated and treated populations affected by drugs or drug violence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. After more than 10 years of U.S. support for Colombia's quest to secure their country, they've begun to self-administer the counter-narcotics, eradication, and alternative development programs that we helped to introduce. In fact, Colombia's consolidation plan to nationalize our joint programs is well underway. Although one of the initial goals of Plan Colombia, reducing the actual area of coca cultivation by 50%, has not been met, current cocaine production potential is approximately 295 metric tons, a 58% decline from the 2001 high of 700 tons, a significant achievement. This decline reflects not only gains through eradication, but also a significantly enhanced interdiction capability, with more than 280 metric tons of cocaine and coca base seized in 2009 by Colombian authorities. Most of these drugs would have otherwise ended up on the hometown streets of America or our partners and allies. Our experiences in Colombia have also informed U.S.-supported initiatives in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, where drug supply or transit threatens our own national security. We know and have factored this into our strategic planning that criminal justice sector capacity building for the host government is the only long-term effective program, that the process is long-term and difficult, that political will is essential, but that the results can be well worth the investment. Mr. Chairman, the title for your hearing today is very important. International counter-narcotics policies, do they reduce domestic consumption or advance other foreign policy goals? As a diplomat who has spent his life representing our nation's interest abroad, my experience has been that our national security objectives and our domestic security objectives are always directly linked. As Director Kurlikowski has noted, we, the United States government, and the American people are already taking some steps on the domestic front. States' efforts abroad to build partner capacity is one additional piece of the administration's larger U.S. drug control policy to reduce the demand for the use of illegal drugs. Thank you for the opportunity to illustrate the role of the Department's foreign assistance programs. I'll do my best to address any of your questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Wexler.
Thank you very much, Chairman Kucinich, Ranking Member Jordan. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Department of Defense's counter-narcotics programs, and in particular the steps we have taken and are taking to improve our performance management system, which I know is a strong interest of the committee. It's a pleasure to appear before you alongside my colleagues. The international illicit drug trade is a multifaceted national security concern for the United States, weakening the rule of law and preventing governments from effectively addressing other transnational threats. The global and regional terrorists who threaten interests of the United States often finance their activities through narcotics trafficking. Through its combatant commands, the military departments and defense agencies, the Department of Defense provides unique capabilities and expertise in support, and that's critical, we are a supporting agency on this mission set, in support of federal, state, local, and foreign law enforcement agencies. Maintaining force readiness through demand reduction programs for the armed services is also a critical component of our counter-narcotics efforts. Roughly half of our just slightly over $1 billion budget for FY 2011 supports international efforts, and the other half supports domestic law enforcement, demand reduction, and intelligence and technology programs. These efforts, coordinated through strong leadership of Director Kurlikowski and his team, are integrated into the Obama administration's wider whole-of-government approach that has been discussed. The narcotics threat has changed dramatically since the 1980s, when trafficking of cocaine directly into Florida made Miami Vice the hit television series. While the Counter-Narcotics mission was not a principal focus of the department, Congress recognized that the Department of Defense was uniquely suited to conduct aerial and maritime surveillance of illicit drug shipments bound for the United States. Department of Defense programs, primarily implemented by U.S. Southern Command and JIADF South, have made tremendous impact on the drug flow directly into Florida and the U.S. mainland since then. While the Counter-Narcotics mission was once slow to be embraced by some defense policymakers, today the department is widely recognized as a critical component of the national drug control strategy, and JIADF South is viewed as a model for interagency coordination and regional engagement. Drugs, of course, still come into Florida, but the scale and challenge of this part of the problem is a shadow of what we confronted in the 1980s. During the late 1990s, Department of Defense played a vital role in the development and implementation of Plan Columbia by providing equipment, information sharing, and capacity building to the Colombian Armed Forces. In Colombia, defense counter-narcotics programs as part of a whole-of-government integrated strategy led by the Department of State, including DEA and USAID, have helped the government of Colombia increase its presence throughout the country, reduce level of violence, disrupt drug production and trafficking, and dismantle drug trafficking organizations. Through these efforts, today Colombia is an exporter of security in the region. Many challenges, of course, remain in Colombia, beginning with the diminished but continuing unacceptable levels of cocaine production there. But by any reasonable measures, the situation in Colombia today is far, far better than that which we confronted in the 1990s. In Mexico, our programs are supporting Professor Calderon's continued campaign to confront rising violence fueled by drug trafficking and other organized crime. Our support to Mexico complements the Merida initiative led by the State Department and is closely coordinated with our interagency partners both at Post and in Washington. Today, we are also applying the appropriate lessons learned in Colombia and elsewhere to confront heroin production and trafficking in Afghanistan. While the Department of Defense has traditionally provided counter-narcotic support to law enforcement missions, in Afghanistan our law enforcement partners such as DEA are providing critical counter-narcotic support for our military objectives. This support is critical because the drug revenues support the Taliban insurgency and undermine the rule of law by fueling corruption. While Afghanistan presents unique and complex challenges, the interagency cooperation fostered in Colombia is paying dividends today in Afghanistan. The revised counter-narcotic strategy that has been referred to previously for Afghanistan emphasizes the whole-of-government approach to counter-narcotics mission that is incorporated into our overall counterinsurgency strategy. Soon after coming into this office last year, it became clear to me that the department needed to do a much better job as it had before in evaluating the effectiveness of our programs. While performance measurements were being collected and reported, they were inconsistent, too focused on inputs and outputs, not adequately aligned with the national drug control strategy, and were rarely used as a basis for budgetary and policy decisions. Many of these issues have been highlighted in the GAO report released today. Recognizing the need to improve these performance management system for the department's counter-narcotics efforts, in June 2009, which was 1 month after I arrived, I launched a comprehensive review of the system. Based on this preliminary assessment, we identified corrective actions, and in May, I issued new performance measurements procedures for all programs my office supports. We are now undergoing a very thorough process to further identify and execute those efforts. In 2011 and beyond, we'll incorporate theater-specific data for each combatant command to further enhance the program's usefulness to leadership and program managers in the field. I spent the last 8 years before returning to government service as a management consultant. This subject is one that I am quite passionate about, and I know that any successful performance management system must be useful to the implementers as well as those making decisions from a programmatic level, so that they can effectively input the data that we are going to need to make the cost-effectiveness decisions that we have to make. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my prepared testimony. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss these issues with you. I look forward to addressing any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much. We're going to have at least 2 rounds of questions to the panel. I'd like to begin with Mr. Kurlikowski. We're looking at what is, without a doubt, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise in just about every country where drugs are produced. What kind of work do you do, and can you give this committee any insight into whether or not there are any banks in this country that end up being the repository of massive amounts of drug money, or banks that are through which drug money is being laundered, banks in the U.S.?
Mr. Chairman, I don't know which banks would be involved in money laundering. I do know certainly.
Do you look to see if banks are involved?
I don't look at the banks. I know that FinCEN, OFAC, the Treasury Department does. I'm very familiar with the Attorney General Goddard's settlement with Western Union, and I'm very familiar with the Department of Homeland Security work that is being done to not only look for the threat when it comes to finances, but also to stop the bulk cash that goes south. So I know that there are a lot of federal law enforcement agencies that are looking at that, and certainly some state and locals.
Now, do either of the other witnesses have any experience or information relating to money being laundered through U.S. banks or drug money being deposited in U.S. banks?
Mr. Chairman, not in U.S. banks. I would use this opportunity, though, to underscore the steps that the Mexican government has taken in the last several weeks, strictly to limit the amount of cash that can be deposited there as a way to provide a method for helping to combat the leakage into their own system.
Mr. Wexler?
Yeah, sure. I would greatly encourage you to ask the Treasury Department this, but as someone who used to work at the Treasury, we have come a long way since the 1990s, when U.S. banks and the Congress was one that discovered this. U.S. banks were actively abetting, in some cases, drug trafficking organizations.
Well, with all the things, funny business that's gone on in Wall Street, it seems like it's an appropriate time to ask that question. We will contact, I'm directing staff. We're going to talk to somebody in Treasury about following up on those questions. Thank you. I want to ask, I read your testimony, Ambassador Johnson. You said that to ensure a comprehensive and coordinated approach to the drug problem in Afghanistan, we're currently working with our interagency and international partners to target narcotics traffickers and drug lords, especially those with ties to the insurgency. Are you also looking at those with ties to the central government?
The Drug Enforcement Administration has its largest deployment anywhere abroad, and a very comprehensive system to look at all forms of trafficking from wherever it is originating, and is working with the Afghan authorities as well as authorities here to develop cases. Those specific cases are something that I'm sure that no one would address during their development stage, but I will assure you that the DEA is looking at this without regard to whom may be involved. Well, the concentration on the traffickers who might be involved with the insurgency is a step that's been taken in order to complement the counterinsurgency strategy of the military, and so the targeting, the focus is of necessity there. But in terms of case development, it's without regard to person.
But if the central government's involved in looking the other way or discouraging reduction in demand, it's quite possible that you ought to be looking at them as well. Isn't that true? Right. You mentioned insurgents. There's an inflection there. I just wanted to see if that inflection represented an omission, a correction, or there was a lack of inclusion there in talking about the central government, which has become famous for corruption. I just wondered what you're doing.
The work has been, I think, of necessity focused as much as possible on where the insurgents are getting their cash and how they're operating in areas where we are seeking to prosecute the war. But to underscore again, the efforts that are being undertaken in the law enforcement area are without regard to origin.
I'm going to ask a question, Mr. Wexler, and then I've got a whole series of questions to ask you about your testimony. Mr. Wexler, given your involvement here, did you ever see any evidence where U.S. resources, particularly those that are being used by contractors of the U.S. government are involved in in either the production of or the shipment of narcotics. Have you ever looked at whether contractors who are said to be working for the U.S. Are actually involved in any drug activities that move the drugs out of the countries in which we're involved militarily?
Sir, I've not seen evidence of any contractors that are involved in the drug trafficking problems that we encounter in Afghanistan. No, sir.
Well, you know, I saw the Secretary of Defense the other day made a statement. He wasn't even sure how many people he had out there in terms of different contractors. So it seems to me to be a fair question, is it not? That if you don't know how many people are out there and you have this big drug problem, to maybe do some kind of cursory review of what's going on with your contractors who may or may not be coming into contact with some of these drug supply routes.
Yes, sir. I can speak to the ones that I know about in my programs, and I can say that I haven't seen that. The general question about contractors I know is one that has the attention at the very highest levels of the Department of Defense, and an awful lot of work is being done because of the some of the wider concerns that you allude to today.
You know, if this whole hearing is about what are we doing to reduce the amount of drugs that are coming into this country and the effectiveness of the programs thereof. Since we have a proliferation of contractors, it seems to me that there's also potential routes into the country that open up through these different contractors. Just thought I'd share with you that observation.
It's a very good point, and the general concern about the contractors, and more to the point, their subcontractors and their subcontractors, is one that has very much the attention of the department. Absolutely.
And you're familiar with the Tierney report about how we contract out, and the contractors have subcontractors who actually end up shooting at our own troops.
Yes, sir.
I mean, so the drug issue comes up in that. Mr. Jordan, thank you for your indulgence. Go on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I think just underscoring the need for the right kind of processes and structures to be in place so we can measure all this. Thank you all for being with us. Mr. Kurtokowski, thank you. I know you've been in front of our committee and Judiciary Committee several times, so we appreciate the work you do and your willingness to come here. The National Drug Control Strategy issued in May of this year states that the administration firmly opposes the legalization of drugs, which is obviously a good statement to see. And that would include, Mr. Kurtokowski, legalization of marijuana.
You're correct, Mr. Jordan.
In light of that, talk to me about what at least appears to be somewhat contradictory, the Justice Department's decision relative to the law in California with respect to marijuana and the National Drug Control Strategy issued just 2 months ago, and likely what may happen in the district relative to the substance of marijuana.
The two issues are the legalization of drugs, including legalization of marijuana, and then the second part is the medical marijuana issue. Medical marijuana has been in California since 1996. I don't think there's anyone that doesn't recognize the explosion in the last several years of medical marijuana dispensaries and recommendations that have come out. The Attorney General, and I believe rightly so, through his office issued guidelines to the 15 U.S. attorneys or 16 U.S. attorneys that operate within districts that have medical marijuana, essentially talking about the finite resources that they had, and that if a medical marijuana dispensary was operating clearly within the laws of that particular state, that the U.S. attorney should consider the use of finite resources, whether or not that would be appropriate. It didn't prohibit them from doing it. The media had an absolute field day with that, and I believe that it was incredibly incorrectly interpreted, because if you read the those guidelines. He said that anything that involves violence, anything that involves for-profit, anything that involves underage sales, and on, that all of the resources or resources of those U.S. attorneys and federal law enforcement resources were appropriate. And we do know that cases have been made by the United States Attorney, and I am aware of active investigations that are going on. So that's the medical marijuana. Drug legalization, marijuana legalization, the administration has firmly repeated that it's either a non-starter.
Let me ask you personally, as head of ONDCP, as the face of our efforts to curtail and hopefully stop the use of drugs in our country, do you think it's appropriate when states or the District of Columbia, well, no, let's just say it this way. Do you agree with the whole medical marijuana approach, frankly, as happening in California right now?
I would tell you that I think that it's very clear that a number of the recommendations, doctors can't issue a prescription. The number of recommendations that are issued by physicians, and it is only a very small percentage of the physicians, are highly questionable. That being said, the medical marijuana question should be decided through the same process that science uses to decide and the United States government uses to decide other medicines.
But I'm asking you personally, with your extensive experience in law enforcement, the good work I think you're doing as the head of this agency, do you personally think these type of laws are beneficial to our country or harmful to our country?
I think there's some benefits in further exploration of what could be helpful to patients as a result of marijuana. I clearly think that this mass amount of media attention that has been given to medical marijuana sends the wrong message and is inappropriate for young people in this country.
That's good to hear. Do you think when states have this medical marijuana statute in place that it makes it easier it's the first step towards legalization? Would you agree with that?
I would tell you that I think that I've heard a number of statements from people that are in the pro-legalization business that medical marijuana issues were a gateway. I still think that there are also, though, some benefits that need to be further explored and further refined for people that could use marijuana in a medicinal way.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I got another line of questioning, but I'll wait till the next round. You're going to do another round?
Oh, yeah,
okay,
we are, yes. Okay. Mr. Wexler. Congress has provided, first of all, I want to say that we have been joined by Mr. Tierney, whose report I cited just before he came into the committee room. We appreciate your presence here. Thank you, sir. Congress has provided over $6 billion to the Department of Defense Counternarcotics program since 2005. GAO reports that since 2006, cocaine removal rates from interdiction have declined and not reached any of the annual targets to date. The 2010 ONDCP strategy calls for the removal of 40% of the cocaine moving through the transit zone annually by 2015. Mr. Wexler, is this goal realistic? How much money will we have to spend to get to that percentage, and what outcomes do you expect as a result of these efforts?
Yes, sir. The goal is realistic if we have the resources, and additional resources will be required to meet that higher goal. I think it's important to set goals that are not easily achievable, but that actually push the agencies to do the best that they can. We are going through a process right now to figure out exactly what combination of additional assets and additional programs might be required to hit that goal. And that's where we are in that process.
Is it cost effective? I mean, are you looking at the cost effectiveness of this?
The answer is yes. And
it is cost effective now?
No, the answer is yes, that we are looking at that problem. Before you get to cost effectiveness, you have to get to effectiveness in the first point. And when we looked at the 285 different metrics that had been left to us by the last administration, we've been reviewing them for a whole variety of characteristics. And what we found is that some of them are applicable and some of them are not applicable for basic level effectiveness. When you get to cost effectiveness, then you have to look at that in the context of the budget process, which we run every year. To be quite honest, we are not there yet, but we have a very, very thorough process to get us there in a way that won't just simply answer your question quickly but easily, and then you'll be asking the same question, you know, 2 years from now when someone else is sitting
You
in the seat.
understand the importance of this, though, because, you know, Congress now, we're looking very seriously at these questions of, you know, you just don't throw money at a problem.
The challenges that you face with the budget are very, very well understood. I believe that one of my primary goals is the steward of U.S. taxpayer dollars on your behalf, and I want to make sure that the programs that we run are not only effective, but are also cost effective. A great amount of things that we do are effective. I will need to find out, and some of them that I've seen I can conclude are cost effective, but I am still doing additional work.
We'll go
for some
deeper
others.
into this. I want to go to Ambassador Johnson just for a minute here. You cited recent declines in production of cocaine in Colombia, but isn't it true that despite fluctuations, coca production has been remarkably steady since before Plan Colombia even began? So after spending over $4 billion on these efforts, illicit crop production is at best slightly lower than it was before we started pouring money into the country's counter-narcotics efforts. It doesn't seem to me to be a good use of taxpayers' dollars. And isn't it true that the production has increased in Peru and Bolivia to offset any gains made in Colombia? So why is eradication still being funded at such high levels? Ambassador.
The statement that you made about changes in Peru and in Colombia, excuse me, and in Bolivia are regrettably true. There have been some sustained.
I like the way you put that. I mean, that was very artfully done. I just want to state that that was artfully done.
Thank you, sir.
Please continue.
There have been some sustained gains in Peru based on programs that work very clearly and very much in a teamwork effort between the eradication efforts that we provide support for, as well as the alternative development and governance building efforts that AID, through the appropriations that it's provided, works with. I think the change in Colombia is reflected over the time that you cite. There was a continued growth in area under cultivation and in cocaine production for a substantial time after Plan Colombia was begun, and that corner was not turned for several years afterwards. But as your previous witness has stated, there's a substantial decline measured over the course of the last several years in the amount of cocaine that's available from that production and the amount that's actually grown in Colombia. Bolivia is a much more challenging situation. We have a program there where we have worked with the government there to address an eradication of a gross amount, but due to changes on the ground there, including the attitude of the government toward coca production, the area under cultivation, in fact, grows in the neighborhood of 10 to 12% per annum over the course of the last several years.
Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Jordan.
Chairman, Mr. Kurkowski, when Mr. Ford was in front of the committee a few minutes ago, I talked to him about whether the GAO had done any assessment of how effective your treatment programs the federal government's involved with. Can you elaborate on and maybe tell us what the GAO has not looked at, your assessments of how you're doing on the treatment side?
I think that I share your concerns and certainly the chair's concerns over the lack of the timely, relevant data. When I was a police chief and made decisions for 2,000 people with several $100 million budget, I actually had a lot more data and a lot more timely data to do that than I've seen here. That's why the National Drug Control Strategy has devoted an entire chapter to improving the quality of the data. There are two things that make the assessment of the treatment programs difficult. One, there is a whole plethora of treatment programs that are out there, and many of the treatment programs report their results in very different ways, as far as recidivism within a month, recidivism within a year, and the fact that actually in treatment, part of treatment is in fact that people relapse. The other problem is that state and local communities often do, either through in-kind services or their own local tax dollars, an awful lot of treatment that we don't have control over. It's interesting that in Mexico right now, they're working very hard to consolidate how treatment is done and how it's measured, because they're seeing a growing addiction population in that country. We could benefit here in the United States from doing the same.
In the folks you contract with, or the folks who provide the treatment, what percentage are faith-based groups or entities who are doing that work?
An awful lot of the treatment is paid for, as you know, from the HHS a block grant that flows to the states. I do not know the percentage of faith-based, but I would tell you that the most recent meta-analysis, for instance, on prevention, talks about that if there are trusted messengers giving young people information, and I'm talking in the prevention area here, that would include faith-based, that can have a positive effect on young people.
But you don't have any measure to say if a faith-based approaches are working better or worse, or more successful, less successful than non-faith-based approach?
I don't know.
Okay, that would certainly be something I would like to follow. Let me just ask you along those lines. There's the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration Modernization Act. I'd like to get your thoughts on a provision contained within that act. This is sponsored by Representative Green, Representative Kennedy. And let me just read a quick paragraph, if I could, Mr. Chairman. Again, this is to Mr. Kurlikowski. With respect to any activity to be funded in whole or part through an award, a grant, a cooperative agreement, or contract under this title, or any other statutory authority of the administration, the administrative director of the center involved, may not make such an award unless the applicant agrees to refrain from considering religion or any profession of faith when making an employment decision regarding an individual who is or will be assigned to carry out the portion of the activity. Do you think we need to place that kind of limitation on some of these faith-based groups who are doing the work of helping treat people with drug problems, this kind of limitation on a faith-based organization? It seems to me what's going to happen is if you place this kind of limitation on those, they'll say, we just can't do the work any longer. We just can't apply because it violates their statement of faith.
I would not want to see that in particular, but what I would like to support is certainly on the hiring decisions that you're not going to discriminate against people coming into those programs based upon the religion. But I think that the faith-based programs can have beneficial effect, and I'd be happy to follow up with you and with SAMHSA.
Well, I'd like to be a little clearer, because it seems to me what you just said is contradictory, because you said you want the faith-based groups to continue to do the work, but if they can't hire the people who support their statement of faith, how are they going to be able to continue to do the work? So that's my point. And it seems to me this act is going to undermine the ability of the faith-based organizations, which you have said are doing some of this treatment and doing a good job at it. If we make this change, we're going to keep them from being able to do this kind of work.
And I'm not sure I agree, Mr. Jordan, because I think if the bar is not to discriminate against somebody coming in, but yet not to prohibit the practice and the way that that organization does the treatment, I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive.
I think what we got to focus on is what's going to help the individual with the drug problem. That's what this whole thing is about today. That's what this hearing is about. That should be our focus. And if these groups are working, I don't think we need to be making this change. But we'll follow up with that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair recognizes Mr. Tierney.
Thank you. Good to see you again, Mr. Kurlikowski and others. Thank you. Look, this is all about the money, right? I mean, that's what people are in this business for? Or does anybody have another suggestion what this time? It's all about the money. We can treat people all day long, but as long as there's money involved, they're going to keep pushing this thing around and find other people to get to deal with. We can interdict it, and they're going to just find a different route to take it to market. We can sort of try to eradicate. They're just going to find another place to grow it. So how do we go about getting the money? Making it, the first thing on corruption, obviously, if we're talking about a place like Afghanistan, you go after the corruption. You arrest the guys, including a stepbrother to Karzai, or whoever it might be in the chain there, and show that you're serious about it, and you take them out of the loop and maybe get some progress there. And I assume that we can talk about that in any country where it's there, but even that's going to be difficult unless you go to get the money. So how do we do that? What are our efforts so far in that regard? How successful have they been or not been? what aren't we doing that we should be doing, because until we take the money out of this, I think we're behind the eight ball. So if I could just go left to right on that.
I think that the money is absolutely critical, and I have been extremely impressed with the work that I've seen lately from FinCEN, from the Department of Treasury, from the Department of Homeland Security. Also some of the state and local efforts. The recent settlement that Attorney General Goddard had with Western Union includes additional law enforcement training in how to detect the money issue for local law enforcement. Quite often we think that it's going to be a federal law enforcement agency that is going to go after the money. What we really need to do is to bring a whole nother group of resources into that fight, and that is the deputy sheriffs and the state and local law enforcement who may not have either the tools or the training to go after the money. We are actually seeing these kinds of training initiatives increase. Along with that, the Department of Homeland Security license plate reader system that can perhaps detect the suspect vehicles that may be going south with the bulk cash, a number of both backscatter X-ray systems and also X-ray vans that the customs on the south side of the border, the Mexican customs, can use. As you know, it was not that common in the past for cars, once they had entered Mexico, to be searched by the government of Mexico customs. That is changing pretty dramatically also. I think also making the going after the money sexy is particularly important. We often spread out the drugs and see the perpetrators when it comes to seizures and weapons. We don't often spread out the money on the table and then make sure that people see what's going on. And I'm sure Mr. Wexler and Ambassador Johnson can tell you about some great work that has been done at interdicting bulk cash outside our borders.
Ambassador?
Congressman, I think virtually every program that we have has some element in it that is dedicated exclusively to chasing cash for its own sake. But I think they also have to be looked at as a combined effort. There aren't any, there's not a single solution to this. And with
let me interrupt you if I can, Ambassador, because just a moment ago, Mr. Kulikowski told me that we're under-resourced in those avenues of changing, of looking at the cash and looking for the money. So I guess with the real paucity of success that we have on interdiction, for instance, where all it does is move it from one place to another, why aren't we considering moving some of the resources from there to a place where we know it'll have more effect?
What I was saying was that we do have resources dedicated to this, but the resources to chasing the money sometimes don't appear directly there. We have resources that are dedicated to these devices and the training for the Mexicans so that they can detect the bulk cash. We have resources that are dedicated to training individuals in places all over the world to inspecting and knowing how to detect individuals who may be leaving through airports with substantial amounts of cash with them. But there's also an element of, for example, the program in Colombia that has to do with reforming the judicial system that allows them to detect people and prosecute them who have been smuggling cash and engaging in money laundering. So these elements, when taken together, I think form a whole. The exact proportion that might be spent more on non-intrusive inspection devices, for example, as opposed to ships at sea, I think that's worthy of some consideration. But it's a multivariable calculation you're trying to make here.
I guess it is, except that we've had years and years and years of experience of not doing very well with interdiction and with eradication. All right, we've shown that we're just bouncing the ball back and forth, whacking it off the wall. Seems to me that the one area we know these guys are interested in and they have to have is cash and money, and they have to launder it, and we're talking banks and everything else. Why don't we just focus there like a laser beam and make this unprofitable for them, and the other stuff will take care of itself if you do that. Mr. Wexler.
Yes, sir. Of course, where the Department of Defense works is primarily focused on this issue in the war zone. And you are exactly right. We have done a tremendous amount of work in the last year on this subject at a strategic level, at an operational level, and at a tactical level. And what we're doing today is tremendously different from where we were 18 months ago. We build out the Afghan Threat Finance Cell in Kabul. We're building out tactical level elements in Kandahar to work at this exact issue and the nexus of the money and the drugs and the insurgency in a coordinated interagency approach so we can bring the military authorities where they are appropriate, but also bring together the law enforcement authorities and the Treasury Department's authorities where those are the appropriate tools to take for against a given target. We have a long way to go on this area, but we have had some significant successes recently, and the level of progress is one that I am very proud of.
I get a little, if I might, Mr. Chairman, just want to say, I get a little concerned when I see stories in the Wall Street Journal about $3 billion being put in cash on a plane and taken out of there. Now, I know some of that is the warlord stuff that we investigated, and that's lining pockets and going out, but I'm concerned that a lot of it is drug cash getting out of there. So we've got a long, long way to go on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
I want to say again that what Chairman Tierney did with his report was extremely important. I hope that all of you will have a chance, and if you haven't already, to study it thoroughly, because when we consider how those people we're trying to work with are actually using U.S. resources to further their own avarice and to try to convert our resources into their own, and the potential of moving drug money out of the country. And we brought up before you came, Mr. Tierney, I brought up the issue of banks. We're going to get the Treasury engaged in that. And maybe we could do that jointly. And I think that the points that he's making are absolutely critical. The underlying dynamics that's driving so much of this is the tremendous amounts of money that people are making. Billions of dollars. And it becomes even more perplexing when you understand that we have brave men and women whose lives are on the line in some of these countries, who are totally dedicated to this country. And somebody's making, some groups are making billions of dollars off of their presence there. It just, there's something fundamentally wrong, so you gentlemen are each charged with a grave responsibility to try to bring some alignment in these policies. I'm just going to go to my a final round of questions, and we'll try to move through this as quickly as possible, and I want to thank you for your indulgence and your time. I want to ask all the witnesses if you think labeling international state-building programs like alternative livelihood programs, rule of law initiatives, and justice reform as counter-narcotics policies, if it makes sense. Mr. Kurlikowski, let's go right down the line.
Right now, we're in the process of reviewing the budgeting accounting system that we are using for drugs. I think, as you know from the NAPA report, there was concern about how things were being accounted. We want to review this, and we are doing it. It will be done in the most transparent way possible.
Can you answer the question, though? I mean, what about labeling these international state-building programs?
I think there should be some portion of them that clearly do work for counter-narcotics, and I would think that there's some in the domestic area that also could be in a counter-narcotics mode also.
I want to go down the line, and then I've got a follow-up question to ask each of you. Go ahead.
I agree with the director. There's some portion of them should be. I think to label them 100% would be misleading. Cost accounting is hard, I know, but I think that in some cases, alternative livelihood is an essential part of a program. For example, in Peru and in Afghanistan, some areas, those programs.
I want to stop you for a second because you just said something about it, potential for being misleading. Because what I was wondering is whether or not there is a risk that labeling these programs as counter-narcotics results in misguided policies because they're being judged based on how drug supply is diminished instead of improvements in good governments or socioeconomic development.
I think that a durable, effective, long-term program will have to have some element, perhaps a significant element, particularly on the rule of law side. We've had, from my point of view, a successful eradication program in Colombia, but that program will be durable over time to the extent that the Colombian authorities, with our support, are able to extend the reach of the state and provide state services, particularly security services and rule of law in areas that are ungoverned or poorly governed.
Wexler.
I'll defer to my colleagues who run the programs for the accounting, but what I can say is what we have recognized is that we cannot succeed in our counter-narcotics objectives based purely on a military approach to this, and we need the alternative development efforts to be part of this integrated plan for our counter-narcotics lines of operations to succeed as part of our wider counterinsurgency programs.
So then what's the significance, Ambassador Johnson, of labeling these state-building programs as counter-narcotics as opposed to just focusing on rule of law initiatives, justice reform? Why are they put into that ambit of counter-narcotics?
Well, part of them have a positive counter-narcotics effect. I'm not sure what you're meaning by put in the label of counter-narcotics. The appropriation that we receive is international narcotics and law enforcement. And there are programs which go beyond counter-narcotics for which I'm responsible.
You make a good point, which is something that this subcommittee should take note of, and that is that if our legislative and appropriation process guides those definitions, that also can drive a combining of programs or an overlap of programs. I thank you for making that point. That's a good point. Director Kurlikowski, ONDCP cites the U.S. role in taking out some of the major drug cartel leaders in Mexico as a sign of the effectiveness of U.S.'s participation in Mexico's war on drugs. Would you comment on the collateral consequences of taking out these cartel leaders, such as the destabilizing of the industry and creating a power vacuum, and does that cause more violence?
I think that it does cause more violence when the heads of some of these organizations are taken out. The anecdotal information is that the people that replace them, and there are always people that will replace them, are not as sophisticated, probably a bad term there, but not as sophisticated as perhaps the more entrenched leadership, and that they in fact may be more reckless. I think that experience is true in what we've seen in whether it was in Northern Ireland or here with our own organized crime.
Well, let me just ask one final question. How endangered is the government of Mexico itself from these cartels? I mean, do these cartels have the power to capsize the government of Mexico?
I do not think so.
Ambassador Johnson?
No.
Wexler?
No.
Okay. Mr. Jordan, final round of
Thank you,
questions.
Mr. Chairman. Just one question. This will be for Ambassador Johnson, if we could. In your testimony, you talk about the experience in Bolivia where they expelled last year all DEA personnel, and yet in the final sentence in that same paragraph, you say, we will provide $20 million in logistics and training to support to Bolivia this year. You know, they kicked all our guys out, and yet we're still giving them money. It's sort of the old line. Why pay people who don't like you? They'd probably not like us for free. I mean, why are we doing that when obviously they said take a hike, and yet we're still sending taxpayer dollars, to the tune of $20 million?
2 points. We're not giving the government of Bolivia any money.
Okay.
We're providing a service in cooperation with them to eradicate a substantial amount of standing coca, which is a program that we've operated there over several decades. I think that you raise a legitimate question as to whether this program, in the face of the absence of political will on the part of the Bolivian authorities clearly to combat these narcotics, is viable in the long term. I think that it is having the intended effect of eliminating a substantial portion of the crop.
But tell me how the money is being spent if we picked out our personnel and yet we're still spending $20 million there. So who do we have there? Tell me how it's working.
We have a team of people who work with the Bolivians, provide them with support for aviation, logistical support for moving around their country, for the destruction of standing crop, as well as interdiction operations. What's missing with the departure of the DEA is an ability to really point those interdiction operations based on solid intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, we got folks there who, so the folks who are there on the ground are the ones handing out the money. or
Excuse me, nobody's handing out any
but
money.
spending the money, helping them, and the people who could enforce the tough, kind of the tough part of the tough love part of it, they're the one, no, we don't want those around. We just want the help part. We don't want the people around who actually see if you know, if we're doing things in the right way.
I don't know, there are a variety of motivations, but I think what's clear is that the program is working effectively as described, but it does not have the ability to work with a solid intelligence-led interdiction effort in the absence of the DEA.
I would agree with that. All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jordan. Mr. Tierney.
Thank you. Mr. Kurlikowski, I first want to thank you for your written responses following the hearing that we had back in March. And we sent some written questions to you, and I want to appreciate the time and effort that you put into answering them. But some of what we explored in those was whether or not there was adequate data to make some of the determinations as to how to distinguish between what attempts are more successful than others in dealing with this issue. And part of your response indicated there's some $42 million or $42.6 million in the President's budget to help collect the data. I'm wondering if that's money well spent, given all the other studies that you cite from RAND and others that had very serious limitations in their usefulness.
I think it's unbelievably well spent when we talk about the multi-millions in the federal drug budget. I'm extremely disappointed to be having to cite 2006 or even 2007 data about who has died as a result of drugs, and then I tell you that this is the most recent data set available. Unfortunately, that is the case. So working with CDC, working with HHS to find out who's coming into jail and what drug are they under the influence of, who's being admitted to an emergency department in a hospital, and what kind of drug are they under the influence of. Coroner's reports, all of those kinds of things are particularly helpful. I mean, I truly believe that as we continue to focus an awful lot on marijuana and youth use, and appropriately so over a number of years, we had this kind of skyrocketing number of people dying from prescription drugs that was just kind of out there. Greater numbers than from gunshot wounds in 16 states, greater numbers than from car crashes. And it's kind of the 800-pound gorilla that nobody was actually recognizing. So I think the data improvement is very important.
Thank you on that. Mr. Wexler, with respect to Afghanistan and the drug trade there, whatever, has the President made any designations under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act of Afghan citizens?
There have been designations, yes. I'm going to have to defer to you to the State Department and the Treasury Department, who run the various designation processes about how many there are in the various names.
Wouldn't you think that you would know that, though? I mean, if you're seriously involved in that area, wouldn't that be one of the things that you'd want to be following up on so that you know?
We absolutely do. We coordinate on every single name to make sure that, and are encouraging this process to do these designations. Again, against any individual target that you're talking about, we want to go through a process to figure out, is the Treasury or the state authorities the right one to use? Should we use a law enforcement approach to go after this individual target? Or in some cases, do we want to use a military kinetic approach to go after that given target in Afghanistan, or a combination of them? And those are the efforts that are being made in the field on every node of the various networks that we have been mapping in each individual case. But there will be a different answer in each case about what the appropriate approach
which
is.
I guess is why I thought that you would have had the information as well, because if you're sort of coordinating this, and I would think every one of you knows who these people are that you're going after and take every opportunity to go after them.
Oh, yes. No.
Assuming there are a limited number of people here that we're talking about, and probably few institutions, because the banks aren't that prevalent here. You're talking more about hawalers and other informal processes, right?
Right. The networks are not inextensive that we're talking about, and there is no shortage of targets that we're going after. When it gets to institutions, then you're correct. Then there's a relatively small number. But when you're talking about individuals and organizations, they're actually, unfortunately, we don't lack for targets.
Ambassador, the last time we went around, I got the feeling I sort of cut you off. That there's something that you wanted to add to your last comment.
Only that the idea of going after the money is something we've been focused on for a very long time and have had extensive programs to address it. But it is also something where the adversary is extremely creative, and as we develop tools, they develop ways to work around them. So the comprehensive effort that Mr. Wexler described about how we're seeking to use new tools on the battlefield is something that we're working on every single day. But I may be the most aged person here, but when I was a bank examiner back in the 70s, we were working on the same problem with people buying expensive automobiles and then turning them in, in 15 minutes later to launder money. So it's an effort that goes on over time, and I think one of the key elements of the work that we do, particularly in Latin America, is on money laundering and civil asset forfeiture, which is the way to take away the proceeds of crime.
Thank you. And again, I apologize if I did cut you off before. So I'm looking at this thing and I'm thinking, about choke points. We've got a lot of money spread out in a lot of different avenues, from interdiction to eradication to hitting the demand side, to going after the money, to going after the precursors, all of that. Is there any merit to the concept of picking one or two areas that we really think are the choke point in that, and consolidating all of our attention and resources on those avenues, and just really leaning hard to try to get some international consensus on that, as well as some interagency consensus, and just going full bore at that one or two areas that we think would have the most effect of shutting these people down? I think we already know it's not eradication, it's already not interdiction, but maybe look at some of the remaining ones and say, we're just going to just double down and put all of our resources into this and set a period of years that we think we should see some effect from it, and just do it.
Attorney, I think if we knew what worked, that would probably be certainly the most helpful way. The sad fact is we don't actually know what works. I would tell you that I think the President's strategy, this very comprehensive strategy, is the best way to go. And I would cite the most recent example when President Obama and President Medvedev met last year, and we started a binational on narcotics. It was only to look at drug traffickers and drug trafficking. It became very clear both to the Federation of Russia and to the United States that that was a narrow way to look at the drug problem, particularly Russia's drug problem with 2.5 million heroin addicts. And it would have to be to look at prevention. It would have to be to look at what type of drug treatment systems are available to get these people back into the workforce. And it would have to be to go after the money, the financiers, the traffickers, et cetera. I think that balanced approach is probably the one that we have to put all our eggs spread across the spectrum, rather than into the two or three things that we might think work.
Yeah, interesting, because I think, again, I think we know it doesn't work, yet we keep doing it. It's, the definition of insanity, I guess. And it's part of it. It's not just this president, it's all the presidents, it's all of us, that have done this. We continue to think that we're just going to keep throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks here. And if we can't figure out what definitely works, if we can't get the data behind it to say this works, we're going to do it, we certainly can get the data behind what doesn't work and say, well, we've been trying this for a few decades now, and that certainly hasn't done it, because we get great enforcement agents and other people out there just beating their heads against the wall. They keep, and I know if you say to them, we're going to stop doing one thing or the other, they're going to get upset because every day they see results. But that's the point. Every day they see results, because there's an endless group of people that will be doing that forever. You can just keep repeating it over and over and over again instead of finding the angle that finally shuts down the operation. But I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tierney. We're going to move on to the third panel in a moment. I just want to thank each one of you for your service, for the work that you do. Mr. Tierney, as he often does, raised a question that requires some deeper level of analysis, and it seems that every time we hold these hearings, and this is the responsibility of this subcommittee, oversight over the Office of National Drug Control Policy, we're required to really ask some deeper questions about why, what drives this seemingly insatiable demand for drugs in our culture. And that's beyond the scope of this particular hearing, but it's sure something that we need to have a national discussion about, in terms of Because for all that you do that works, that doesn't work, we can continue to go over this from now until kingdom come about what works, what doesn't work. We're missing the deeper question. What is it in our culture that drives this tremendous demand for these various types of drugs? I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but it's sure something that we need to get into, because otherwise all we're doing is shuffling policy this way, that way, and you still have this tremendous demand and a supply that's readily available where people who are selling it are ready to risk life, limb to make billions of dollars. So thank you for the service to the country, and we will move on to the third panel, which I'll introduce while the staff proceeds with the changing of the table there. Our third panel includes Adam Isaacson, Senior Associate for Regional Security at the Washington Office of Latin America. He joined the Washington Office of Latin America in 2010 after 14 years working on Latin American and Caribbean security issues with the Center for International Policy. Vonda Felbob Brown is a foreign policy fellow at the Brookings Institution. She focuses on the national security implications of illicit economies and strategies for managing them. She is an adjunct professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. And Mark Kleiman. Is that Kleiman? Kleiman is professor of public policy in the UCLA School of Public Affairs. Professor Kleiman is a renowned expert on drug policy, teaches courses on methods of policy analysis, on drug abuse and crime control policy. As with those on the first and second panel, we ask that each witness give an oral summary of his or her testimony. Keep the summary 5 minutes in duration, and your complete written statement is going to be included in the hearing record. It is customary for all witnesses before our full committee and subcommittee to be sworn. I would ask that you raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that each of the witnesses has answered in the affirmative. So you may proceed with your testimony. Mr. Isaacson, please begin.
Chairman Kucinich, Ranking Member Jordan, Mr. Tierney, I want to say a big thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing that I think is badly needed, and I congratulate you for holding it. I look forward to a good discussion. A big part of my work at the Washington Office on Latin America is monitoring U.S. aid to that part of the world. And where Latin America is concerned, U.S. aid really does mean counter-drug aid. In the 10 years between 2000 and 2009, 48% of our aid dollars spent in Latin America, $9.9 billion, went through counter-narcotics accounts in the state and defense departments' budgets. When you look only at the military and police aid that went to the whole region, 85% is counter-drug aid. So for all that, have we managed to reduce drug supplies? I'm afraid the answer is no. Look at cocaine, which is the only illegal drug produced entirely in Latin America, and by every measure, the tons produced, the price on U.S. streets, drug-related violence, these 10 years of aid did not reduce cocaine supplies. My written testimony provides the numbers comparing 2000 and 2009. So where do we go from here? In fact, the experience of the past 10 years in Colombia, Mexico, and elsewhere offers some compelling lessons. The first is that we have to do far more to reduce our own citizens' demand for illegal drugs. The new National Drug Control Strategy puts a greater priority on drug treatment, which is welcome, and let's hope it translates into greater resources in the next several years' budgets. Also, community corrections programs like Hawaii's HOPE probation program deserve more support. In Latin America, meanwhile, the lessons really are pointing in two directions. Broad directions, strengthening states and reducing impunity. And while that sounds a bit like academic jargon, they deserve to be unpacked a bit. First, strengthening states. Counter-narcotics programs don't prosper in a vacuum of government. Whether that vacuum, it could be a wild jungle coca-growing region, or it could be a gang-ridden slum in a Latin American city, drug trafficking will thrive there if there's no state presence. And note I say state presence, not military occupation. Of course, I mean, you can't set up big economic aid programs without security forces there to protect them, but military occupations also fail when the civilian part of the government doesn't show up. I mean the part that provides public goods beyond just security, property rights, equal protection under law, farm-to-market roads, health, education, clean water, a stable financial system. Second, impunity. Establishing a government presence, even a civilian government presence, isn't enough if it doesn't include a strong, credible judicial system alongside it. If a government is in a zone but it's acting abusively or corruptly toward its own people, and it does so without fear of punishment, then that population is not going to support its government. State presence can actually make matters worse without a judiciary in place to ensure nobody's above the law. Now, when the United States provides judicial aid, which we do, it has to include more for physical security for judges, prosecutors, investigators, and witnesses. It has to help increase manpower to reduce caseloads. And the investigators in these countries need technology, databases, data security, crime labs, DNA, forensics. This sort of strengthening states without impunity framework may be the best approach, but the thing is there's little specifically counter-narcotic about it. Put plainly, it's nation building. Programs like consolidation or integrated action in Colombia, which has been going on the last couple of years in Colombia, or helping Mexico reform its police and judiciary, they're costly and they require long-term commitments. By now, though, I think we've seen that there's really no other shortcuts. Is the United States government set up to help in this way? The agencies that provide the most aid to Latin America, who are represented on the last panel, INL at State, DASD Counternarcotics at Defense, they're counter-narcotics agencies. They're not governance and development agencies. And the White House office providing policy direction, ONDCP, they're limited to a narrower counter-drug mandate too. These agencies have important contributions to make, but I think the natural lead agency for civilian governance aid would be USAID. Where judicial reform is involved, it would be USAID and the Department of Justice. In the past, there has been aid for these priorities, but it's usually been channeled through the State Department's International Narcotics Control account. I think that's unnecessary, and it adds an extra layer that slows the delivery of aid. If we move in this direction, what will happen? If we expand the amount of territory that's governed and strengthen the rule of law in countries like Colombia and Mexico, those countries could become less hospitable to cocaine. But global demand for cocaine is likely to remain stable. The balloon effect tells us supply will move to other countries with weaker governance and greater impunity. Peru and Bolivia are seeing more cocaine right now. Central America is seeing more transshipment and cartel activity. We have to be vigilant about where the trade is migrating and start working proactively with those governments to strengthen their own capacities, especially their civilian and judicial capacities. Again, ONDCP and other counter-drug agencies will have an important role to play, but from now on it must be in support of a much larger governance and justice effort. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Feldbab-Brown, proceed.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Tierney, I am honored to have this opportunity to address you. As long as there is strong demand for illicit narcotics, supply-side measures should not be and cannot be expected to stop supply and prevent consumption. However, supply-side policies do have a great impact on the level of threat that the drug trade and drug trafficking organization and other non-state armed actors pose to state and societies in source and transshipment countries. They impact conflict intensity, institutional development, human rights, and basic state-society relations in source and transshipment countries. Often they do not do so in a positive way. Let me now highlight several general lessons about the effect of supply-side policies on these broader issues, and I'll be happy in the question period to talk specifically about Afghanistan, Mexico, or Colombia. The drug trade generates multiple threats to the United States and other states and societies. It often threatens public safety, at times even national security, in supply and transshipment countries. It can also compromise the political systems by increasing corruption and penetration by criminal entities and undermine legal economies. At the same time, large populations around the world in areas of minimal state presence, great poverty, and social and political marginalization are dependent on illicit economies, including the drug trade, for basic survival and the satisfaction of other socioeconomic needs. Supply-side measures, such as eradication and interdiction, have not yet succeeded in disrupting global supply of drugs in any lasting way. However, supply-side measures have at times been effective in suppressing production in particular locales. A good security is a key precondition for this success. Short of great political oppression that is deeply inconsistent with US values and interests, the second condition for success of supply-side policy in suppressing production in particular locales is a multifaceted state-building effort that seeks to strengthen the bonds between the state and marginalized communities dependent or vulnerable to participation in the drug trade. One component of such a program is the proper sequencing of alternative livelihood efforts and eradication, with eradication being implemented only when legal economic alternatives are in place. Effective alternative livelihoods requires further that it be designed as a well-funding, long-lasting, and comprehensive approach that does not merely center on searching for the replacement crop. It really amounts to either comprehensive rural development and, in places like Mexico or Brazil, a complex urban planning. The state-building approach also needs to include other components of state presence, such as the strengthening of law enforcement and justice and correction systems. But it needs to do so in a way that holds these other mechanisms and components of the state accountable to citizens. Interdiction does play a critical part in supply-side policies, including in ways to achieve these state-building objectives, but it should not be conceived primarily as a mechanism to stop supply, but rather as a mechanism to beef up law enforcement to prevent the ability of drug trafficking organizations to coerce or corrupt a state and societies. Stopping weapons flows and anti-money laundering measures are important components, but they should not be overstated in their effectiveness. They do not represent silver bullets, and indeed they are often some of the least effective approaches to be undertaken. Even when successful in particular locales, supply-side measures have inevitably transferred the transshipment or supply problems to new locales, whether these are new areas within a country or there are new countries altogether. The recognition of the balloon effect requires strategic prioritization of effort. The imperative to mitigate spillover effects to other countries, however, should not give impetus to simply rush to assist with counter-narcotics law enforcement efforts to new areas. Some of these areas, including in Central America and West Africa, have such weak state and law enforcement capacity and such high levels of corruption that their capacity to constructively absorb external assistance is limited. In devising supply-side policies, the United States needs to be aware of the limits to effectiveness of outside policy intervention and assistance. If we accept the proposition that supply-side policies are a critical component of state-building efforts and indeed should be construed as state-building efforts, we need to, however, realize that there is only so much an outside country can do to change the basic socioeconomic and political arrangements that persist in countries. And indeed, these socio-political arrangements, such as taxation system, will have great effect on the effectiveness of counter-narcotics policies. It is imperative that the US Congress demands of the executive detailed reporting on the design and effects of counter-narcotics policies abroad that focuses not simply on outputs, but indeed outcomes. Measures to reduce demand abroad must be a key component of US counter-narcotics policies. Many countries today have consumption levels on par or even greater than the United States. Many of these are located in Asia, in Latin America. Finally, it is important that consideration is given in the design of policies to second-degree effects and unintended consequences. A regular part of any policy analysis should be to consider where supply or smuggling routes will shift if counter-narcotics efforts are successful in particular locales. What kind of illegal enterprises or economies will criminal groups turn if their proceeds from the drug trade are diminished? Will they in fact seek to penetrate to a greater degree the legal economies? And whether these developments pose a greater threat to the United States and partner countries than the current conditions? Thank you.
Professor Kleiman.
Mr. Chairman, it's an honor to be invited testify before this august body. Mr. Chairman, having required me to take an oath to tell the whole truth, I hope you will pardon me if I don't pull any punches. My theme today is the logic of counter-drug strategies in the context of insurgency and terrorism. My claim is that we have let the pieties of the drug war blind us to economic reality, and commit us to unattainable goals. We make some drugs illegal because of the problem of drug abuse, and seems to be the best refutation to the claim that we would improve matters by legalizing them is to look at the one drug we legalized, alcohol, which causes more damage than all the illicit drugs combined. And by the way, somewhat modifies, Mr. Chairman, the claim that the U.S. has an unusual appetite for drugs. We have an unusual appetite for illicit drugs. In fact, if you add back alcohol, we're sort of in the middle of the league table. Anyway, we ban drugs because we're worried about drug abuse. Once the drugs are illegal, trafficking in them is a source of criminal revenue. The same capacities that allow an organization to function as a terrorist organization, secrecy, loyalty, weaponry, allow it also to function as a drug dealing organization. And when a terrorist or insurgent group controls a piece of territory, it can collect money from drug dealers who operate in that territory, either as tax or in return for actual services in protecting drug dealers from one another and from law enforcement. And indeed, drugs provided some of the funding for the Contras, for the FARC, for the Colombian Paras, for the Northern Alliance warlords, and for the Taliban. Preventing terrorists and insurgents from successfully engaging in or taxing drug dealing is one way to reduce their power. And fighting drug-related corruption is one way to improve governance. So much is true. But the following, Mr. Chairman, is not true. That doing drug law enforcement generally in areas where terrorists operate is the same as fighting terrorism. That counter-narcotics is counterinsurgency. Not only is that not true, it is precisely backwards. Drug enforcement raises prices. Volume doesn't go down nearly as much as price goes up, especially for exported drugs. Therefore, drug enforcement tends to make drug dealers in general richer, which indirectly benefits those who can extract taxes from them. Worse, insofar as terrorists function as drug dealers, they're among the harder sorts of drug dealers to catch because they have violence and influence at their command. So it's mostly their competitors we're going to put out of business unless we target very carefully. So drug enforcement without respect to persons, as one of the earlier witnesses mentioned, is exactly the wrong thing to do. Moreover, the value of protection services goes up as the intensity of enforcement goes up. The bigger a threat law enforcement is to drug dealing, the more it's worthwhile paying an insurgent or a warlord for protection. So, untargeted drug law enforcement provides material support for terrorism. It's not anybody's intention, but that's the result. It's true in Afghanistan. I think it's true in Mexico. The goal, which has been discussed today extensively, the goal of stopping the flow is unattainable. Drug consumption in the United States is determined overwhelmingly by conditions in the United States, not abroad. We can redirect the flow. We can try to control the collateral damage. But the effort to solve our drug problem in someone else's country is worse than futile. Mr. Chairman, the myth of Sisyphus. Sisyphus is punished for some outrageous misdeed in the afterlife by being forced to continually roll a stone up a hill, and as soon as he gets to the top of the hill, it rolls back down. The myth is familiar. I don't believe the GAO report on that myth is familiar, but it's entitled, "Stone Rolling Goals Not Being Achieved, Sisyphus Needs to Assert Better Performance Measures." And then it goes on to say that he needs to push the stone up the hill more often and have a goal of doubling the amount of time it stays at the top of the hill before it rolls back down within the next 3 years. When you're pursuing an exercise in futility, it doesn't do any good to measure it more precisely. 90% of the cost of drugs in the U.S. to U.S. users is U.S. markups. We cannot fix this problem overseas. And yes, we can reduce drug production in some parts of Afghanistan and it'll go up in other parts of Afghanistan. It was mentioned that a number of about 27 of the 34 provinces of Afghanistan are now poppy-free. That's regarded as an accomplishment. The other 7 are the ones controlled by the Taliban. So our accomplishment is to have made our enemies a monopolist in the world opium trade. I suggest that's not something we want to simply measure more accurately. It needs to be rethought. And we need to change the rhetoric of international drug control. A report yesterday in the Chinese news service Xinhua quotes a UN official as dismissing the arguments that show how drug enforcement can enrich terrorists. It must be right, he says, to crack down on anyone who is deeply involved in the drug trade, right? That's your drug enforcement without respect to persons. It must be right. Mr. Chairman, I submit that is the language of incantation, not of analysis. It must be right because we've been saying it for years, but that doesn't keep it from being wrong. So, I claim that we need to rethink our policies in Afghanistan, targeted enforcement, targeted at insurgents, anti-corruption efforts. In Mexico, I think we need to think about picking one of the big drug trafficking organizations and taking it down by making it uncompetitive. I'll be happy to answer questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Kleiman. Mr. Isaacson, in looking at your testimony, you talk about the extraordinary amount of money that goes for, or that has gone over the past for military aid related to counter-narcotics. Our military budget carries within it headlong momentum that keeps funding hardware far into the future, notwithstanding exigent circumstances or long-term predicted circumstances for their use. Since such a substantial amount of money goes to fund the hardware side of this, is it possible that one of the driving forces for funding these, quote, counter-narcotics efforts is a continued support for this military-industrial complex?
I don't know who coined the term drug war industrial complex, but there certainly is such a thing. I mean, there are...
Such a thing as what?
As a drug war industrial complex, where you've got companies, whether they're making helicopters or other hardware, or whether they're contractors who are actually carrying out programs like aerial herbicide fumigation, who have a very strong interest and actually do lobby actively in favor of increased counter-drug spending.
Do you want to comment, Professor Svelbit-Brown? If you have anything to say. Let me ask you another question here. Dr. Felbert-Brown, what do you think about Professor Kleiman's conclusion that alternative livelihood programs in Afghanistan contribute directly to funding the insurgency? Is this, am I quoting this correctly, through taxes levied by the insurgents on the alternative livelihood programs?
Right, so there are two aspects of it. And this argument I should really...
Did I characterize that question, did I characterize your conclusion correctly?
One half of it is that there may be taxation of the effort. The other thing is, if you succeed in getting some farmers to not grow poppy, particularly in government-controlled areas, you're increasing the demand for poppy in non-government-controlled areas.
Ms. Felbert-Brown.
Well, I agree with the proposition that the Taliban taxes a lot of different economies, both legal and illegal, including aid projects. And US-funded aid projects. That's a consequence of the fact that the government and the ISAF does not have good territorial control and be able to prevent Taliban penetration. I would, however, argue that should not be the position then to cancel these programs, because I do not believe that insurgencies can be defeated through the efforts to bankrupt them. There is no evidence that any insurgency has as yet been defeated through efforts to bankrupt them, whether these efforts were interdiction of counter-narcotics of narcotics generated money or eradication programs.
Well, indeed, you pointed out in your testimony that it is, quote, highly unlikely that interdiction measures can significantly reduce the Taliban's income and greatly limit its operational capacity, unquote.
Indeed. However, I do believe that it is critical for winning insurgencies, for winning counterinsurgencies, for defeating insurgency, to win the hearts and minds of the population. Offering better governance, greater security, and better economic options is a critical component of that.
But in doing that, you can talk about better government. There is an assumption that when we say better government, we mean not the Taliban, we mean central government, but the corruption in the central government, which by now is legendary, has linked government with traffickers. And you're saying that, there's a need to target, quote, target government-linked traffickers to send a message that the era of impunity is over.
Indeed, you are right, sir. Perhaps the Achilles heel of our project in Afghanistan is the poor quality of governance that includes corruption linked to drugs, includes many other forms of malfeasance and corruption. I agree with Professor Kleiman's testimony that the more we simply blanketly use law enforcement, the more likely it is that the most violent armed actors will end up being the ones holding the largest proportion of the traffic. So I think there is some great wisdom in focusing on Taliban-linked traffickers. However, the other component of insurgency, of counterinsurgency, is of course to show that the population, that the government is more just, can provide better governance. And because the corruption is so notorious and so detrimental, it is important that at least some of the highest linked traffickers linked to the highest members of the government are prosecuted and done so effectively.
I'm going to direct staff. I think that your testimony with respect to Afghanistan is quite compelling. Particularly in terms of the right, how our programs can raise expectations among the population and then withdraw the money suddenly, and the expectations plummet, support for insurgencies continue. I'm going to recommend your testimony to be read by the Secretary of Defense and by General Petraeus, because I think we really need to have a strong response from them about the observations that you've made before this subcommittee in your testimony. I'm going to move on to Mr. Tierney, and then we'll have another round of questions for the panel. Mr. Tierney.
Thank you, and hello to all of you, and thank you for your testimony, written and oral, on that. Ms. Falbo-Brown, the program, the so-called AVIPA Plus program that they're running out of Afghanistan down in Helmand and Kandahar provinces, where they give cash for work, small grants, basically to procure different equipment or whatever, vouchers for high-tech sort of things on the farming, whatever, and training with respect to all of that. Have you had any knowledge about whether or not there's been any success with that or how that's going?
Well, Mr. Tierney, it is very difficult to judge success because the programs have been in place for relatively little period, and often the reporting that we hear from members of the executive are reporting on outputs, not necessarily outcomes. So I think there is a great need for careful monitoring. That said, I do have some concern along the lines that Mr. Kucinich raised. I am concerned that some of these programs are being designed as buy-offs of the population rather than effective, sustainable long-term development. And I understand the excruciating dilemma that the administration is facing, ISAF is facing, in needing to win hearts and minds, including because the lives of our men and women are at stake, and because the timeline is running out. But there is a real danger that the buyouts will not be effective, that they will not sufficiently buy the population, and at the same time, when they are no longer sustainable because funding ends, they will then be directly counterproductive. They will in fact alienate the population. And we have seen that with many programs where emphasis have been put on the physical structure. Development sort of isn't if you cannot kick the building, the school, as opposed to, for example, providing teachers or doctors. And people have been deeply, deeply disappointed and antagonized. And at the same time, we have not seen that programs such as Offering Village or Diesel Generator are sufficient to generate intelligence flows to make a big difference on the battlefield. So while I absolutely understand the imperative to demonstrate to the population that the better future lies with the government supported by ISAF, I would be very concerned not to design the programs as short-term buy-offs.
A question for all of you is, do you think we're approaching this in the wrong way if we're seeing all of these as sort of counter-narcotics programs, as opposed to just focusing on the development aspect of that and say, look, that there's many different outcomes you could have from a good development program, to say that it's just part of counter-narcotics and focusing money from the counter-narcotics program over there as opposed to broadening out the concept moving forward? Would that be a better approach, Mr. Isaacson?
I do agree that it is the wrong approach, because if you're calling it a counter-narcotics program, it completely changes how you measure success. You're not measuring how many people feel like they're governed. You're not measuring how many people have government representatives in their town saying, you can't grow this anymore, but you have alternatives. You're measuring how many acres of crops were destroyed, or you're measuring some estimate of how many tons were produced. And that doesn't really capture the picture, and it captures something that can perhaps show short-term gains and fluctuations, but not the overall trend.
Mr. Conlon?
Mr. Tierney, I completely agree. Insofar as we're measuring reductions in drug production, we're measuring exactly the wrong thing. We want to measure whether we're making farmers richer and more trustful of the government. Afghanistan currently has about 90% of the world's opium production. There's no country in the old world that's nearly competitive with Afghanistan in terms of producing opium. Now, I'm not saying that 10 years from now there won't be another producer, because producers do change. In the near term, Afghanistan is going to produce all the opium that the old world wants. And that's then a function of supply and consumption conditions in Iran, in Russia, in Europe, in Pakistan. To try to reduce drug production in Afghanistan is completely misguided. A very small portion of the price that a drug user pays for heroin is accounted for by the value of poppy at the farm gate, or even of heroin at the refinery gate in Afghanistan. So a lot of enforcement effort can push that price up a little bit, not going to change consumption very much, not going to make some other country. And if you really wanted to reduce drug consumption in Afghanistan, pray for a failed state in Burma. Right? If Burma completely collapsed, it might compete with Afghanistan in poppy production. But we're not going to reduce poppy production in Afghanistan by chopping down crops, or by paying people not to grow crops, or by arresting heroin processors or dealers. It just doesn't work that way. 4% of the arable land in Afghanistan is planted in poppy. Land is not scarce. And we've well demonstrated that we can move poppy production around Afghanistan, but not change the volume. I don't think changing the volume is a realistic goal. I don't think protecting, in Afghanistan, of course, it's ridiculous, because we get very little heroin from Afghanistan. But for the whole world, the notion that the goal of our foreign drug programs is to protect drug consumers in the U.S., completely misguided. We want to protect drug consumers in the U.S. We have to do stuff about drug demand in the U.S. That does not mean offering treatment to addicts and lying to school children. It means finding the heavy drug users who are mostly in the criminal justice system, getting them to stop. Professor Hawken will be talking about that tomorrow, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tierney. We're going to have one brief round of questions of the witnesses. I'm looking at your testimony, Mr. Isaacson, and it's a very, very well researched. Much appreciated. I want to ask you, in your research, have you ever seen any indication that there is a narcotics strategy being used by intelligence interests to try to destabilize governments? Is that possible? For example, we've received information that, I mean, it's probably public knowledge, but that there's been a proliferation of drugs from certain areas in Asia into Russia. Now, is there ever any? Have you ever heard of any, aside from the obvious incentives of selling drugs?
The actual fostering of narcotics in order to undermine an enemy country, something like that.
Has that ever happened?
I cannot think of any real examples in Latin
Is that just
America.
the stuff of science fiction, or?
No, I would have to look at maybe the work of Professor Al McCoy, who did some work on this in Southeast Asia, but I'm not very familiar with it.
Does anyone have anything to offer about that? I'm just...
Well, during the 1980s Soviet war in Afghanistan, Soviet military faced very large addiction rates, and the Soviet military leadership often believed that this was not accidental, that
what was not accidental?
that the addiction rates among the Soviet military were not accidental, and they believed that the U.S. Perhaps encouraged the addiction rates. Of course, the reality is that the conditions of the Russian troops, the Soviet troops in Afghanistan, were often so difficult that it motivated many soldiers without outside help to resort to narcotics.
Amen to that. There's a long-term flip of this, right? I mean, you can get uncounted numbers of pamphlets explaining how the communists are flooding the United States with drugs, right? So it was the North Koreans, or it was the Cubans, or it was the Russians. There's a persistent fantasy that the cause of drug trafficking is drug traffickers. The cause of drug trafficking is consumption.
Right.
And no, it doesn't need any help from the United States or anybody else for Russia, given its current economic and social and political conditions, to have a terrific drug problem.
I would just, final question to each member of the panel. Spending on interdiction and international counter-narcotics programs has increased by almost 100% since 2002. If you were asked which programs should be cut to get us back to the spending levels of, let's say, the pre-Bush administration, what would be your recommendation?
Let's see. If you were to divide the hard side strategies into interdiction, eradication, and sort of going after the kingpins, I'd say eradication should take the deepest cut by far, because it really has not, it's almost been counterproductive in some places.
I agree with that statement, and I would suggest, however, that interdiction should be reoriented from the futile effort of thinking that borders can be closed, whether U.S. borders or borders in Afghanistan or borders along Colombia, and instead focus on building effective law enforcement that tackles crime, street crime, not just organized crime, and that is accountable to the citizens of the country.
Professor.
It was mentioned earlier in the hearing that the task force in the Caribbean substantially disrupted the drug trade from Colombia into South Florida, and that's true. What was not mentioned, but is explained quite clearly in Rob Bonner's foreign policy article, is that the result was the development of the throughput trade through Central America and Mexico. The current Mexican crisis is the consequence of our successful interdiction effort in the Caribbean. It seems to me if we had to choose between destabilizing the Bahamas and destabilizing Mexico, I think that's an easy choice. So the first thing I would cut would be the Caribbean effort. Now, I say that not having to get any votes in Florida, but we're currently doing something really disastrous to Mexico by making it hard to get drugs in the other way. If we stop imagining that we're going to solve our drug problem, start to say, look, the flow into the U.S. depends on demand in the U.S. and the sales organizations in the U.S., and we can do something about them. And then all we can do is decide how the drugs come in and how much damage they do. That seems to me ought to be the new focus. And as long as we tell the interdiction people that their job is keeping drugs out of the country, we are condemning them to futility, as Jack Lawn said when he was DEA administrator, and a member of Congress asked him why we couldn't just keep the drugs out of the country. He said, Congressman, if we built a 50-foot wall around the United States, the traffickers would buy 51-foot ladders.
Because there's supplying and demand.
Because they're supplying and demand, we can sometimes reduce the street availability of drugs in a way that reduces consumption. That's turned out to be very hard. We have 15 times as many cocaine dealers in prison in the United States today as we had in 1980. Price of cocaine is down by 90%. What we can do more effectively, since most of the drugs go to heavy users, most of the heavy users are criminally active and get arrested. So they're going to be on pretrial release, on probation, or on parole when they're not in prison or jail. The Hope Project has demonstrated that you can enormously reduce their drug consumption. And since they're where the drug consumers are, that's our hope for reducing the damage we're doing to Mexico through our demand for illicit drugs.
This subcommittee is going to continue its oversight of the Office of National Drug Control Policy and of the more broad question of supply and demand with respect to the United States. And so because of that, you as witnesses, because you've been so helpful to the work of this subcommittee, you may find yourself being invited again to testify. Each of you has developed a very incisive expertise that has helped to inform the work of this subcommittee, and we're very grateful for that. I just want to express that to you individually and collectively.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This is the Domestic Policy Subcommittee of Oversight and Government Reform. The topic of today's hearing has been international counter-narcotics policies. Do they reduce domestic consumption or advance other foreign policy goals? We have been gifted with 3 panels of witnesses, all of whom have helped us to explore this question, and which we will continue. I want to thank the staff of our majority as well as the minority for their participation, as well as for Mr. Tierney and Mr. Jordan's participation. This committee stands adjourned.
She does come and visit Eric. She does, yes.
It's one of the delights of my life. I get to tutor her in math and spelling and watch this little precious girl grow up.
Eric, there are people who would say that this is no place for a child, a prison environment. Why do you think that you had to bring that child at all?
She was a part of this family that I was marrying. She was part of Tammy. She was Tammy's little girl. I wanted desperately to meet her. She didn't visit for the first year or so, as Tammy and I discussed exactly what was appropriate.
What have you told her?
She asks why Eric is not home. And I tell her that he's not home because he did a very bad thing, and he has to stay here.
What will you tell her in a few years when she's old enough to really ask, what did he do?
I will have to tell her. I will have to tell her the truth, yes.
When we return, Eric Menendez speaks out on the evidence he says the jury in the second trial never got to hear.
They got excluded dozens of my family members who saw, witnessed, and were there throughout my life.
And Tammy on coming to terms with Eric's crime.
I understand what brought him to do what he did. I understand it, but I do not condone.
When 2020 on We continues.
We TV tomorrow.
Wow, the two of us are totally on our own.
Jenny and Brian are about to take the biggest risk of their lives.
You don't have any idea how hard it's going to be.
And along the way, put their marriage to the test.
We have to rely on each other. It's going to make us both step up to the plate.
This just got a whole lot more complicated.
Raising Sextuplets, all new tomorrow at 10 on We TV.
Introducing new Stouffer's Toasted Subs. 4 varieties like Meatball Italiano made with delicious meats and melted cheeses on bakery fresh tasting bread that crisps in the microwave in minutes. The taste of your favorite sub shop without leaving home. New Stouffer's Toasted Subs.
This was the day you thought your period would play nice. Now bloating and fatigue make the cramps an even bigger pain. You need Midol Complete. It does what Tylenol can't. Stops the fatigue, the bloating, as well as the cramps. Don't just get through your period. Midolize it.
Is it a place for everything? Is it enough space for a banquet? Is it everyone's favorite restaurant? It's the LG French door refrigerator with Slim Space Plus size system for maximum shelf space. So is it a refrigerator or something better?
You want a great body? Get ready for summer in just 21 days with the Montenegro method. Using the latest in fitness science, Marta Montenegro has created a revolutionary new method that delivers the most efficient workouts with maximum results.
Let's work out.
Marta's progressive strength training routines build lean muscle, boost your metabolism, and will reshape and tone your entire body in just 21 days. That's right, just 21 days to a long, lean, and toned body. If you do the Montenegro method, you're guaranteed to see results.
You can do it.
Call now, and we'll send you absolutely free the Montenegro Method Power DVD, featuring 4 10-minute full-body strength and cardio routines that will accelerate your metabolism and burn fat fast. You only pay shipping and handling. Get ready for summer and redefine your body with the Montenegro method.
If you've struggled with weight loss but have never tried Jenny Craig, here's your chance with a special limited time offer. Call now and you'll receive a free consultation plus a full week of food for just $49. That's 7 breakfasts, 7 lunches, 7 dinners, and 7 snacks for only $7 a day. What do you have to lose? With food this good and your own personal consultant, you'll finally have a plan you can stick with. Call 1-800-JENNY20 now and ask for the $49 special. Hurry, this offer ends soon.
Go back. Go now. Whatever your age. Look up to 5 years younger in 14 days. Introducing a new emulsions. Another breakthrough from Avon. High-intensity emulsion works super fast. You'll see the change, no matter what your age. Look up to 5 years younger in 14 days. A new emulsions by Avon. There's one for your age. Want it? Get it. Call 1-800-4AVON or visit avon.com to find a representative today.
13 years after murdering his parents, Eric Menendez spoke with Barbara Walters about his relationship with his family and his hopes for a new trial.
The truth about what Eric and Lyle Menendez did was clear. The brothers admitted they shot their parents. They admitted that when their shotguns ran out of ammunition, they took a moment to reload. The truth about why they committed this horrible crime was the key question for their jury. Here now is Eric's version. Looking back now, why did you kill your parents?
It's so hard for me to answer that question. I'm still trying to come to terms with what happened. I was so terrified, Bob. I had total fear of my dad. And after 12 years of being sexually tortured by my father, it all came to a head, and in a sense, I lost my mind. I really believed that they were going to kill me to keep the secret.
Why did you kill your mother?
I saw them as the same person. She knew all along what had been going on, the sex between Dad and I, and she told me that it was not her responsibility. And in the end, I saw them as the same.
Eric says at that moment, he feared both his mother and his father equally. You were 18 years old at the time of the murder. Why didn't you just run away?
I did when I was 13. I tried to run away. My dad found me. He said, if you ever try to run away again, I will kill you. I will hunt you down. It was not conceivable to me that I could run away. It was so pounded into my head.
But for all their fear and emotional turmoil, the brothers managed to lie about the killings for months, during which time they spent many thousands on Rolex watches, cars, and first-class vacations. They might have gotten away with it forever. They were only arrested after Eric, in torment, made a confession to his psychiatrist, which wound up in the hands of the police. Lyle was arrested in California. Eric, who was in Israel at the time, flew home voluntarily to surrender. Do you regret confessing?
No, oh no, I needed to have gotten arrested. I needed to have been punished. I needed to tell my family what I did. I needed to face consequences.
But now it appears both Menendez brothers feel the consequences they face are too severe, and both are challenging their convictions in federal court, hoping to win new trials. On what grounds are you appealing your conviction?
That I didn't receive a fair trial.
In what sense?
Well, all I wanted was for the jury to hear all of the evidence, and that didn't happen in my trial. The district attorney made sure that they got excluded dozens of my family members who saw, who witnessed, who were there throughout my life, the emotional and physical torture that my brother and I went through.
Although he allowed those witnesses to testify in the first trial, in the second trial, the same judge, Stanley Weisberg, ruled that since the witnesses hadn't seen any sexual abuse, their testimony wasn't relevant. Dr. Stuart Hart, a nationally recognized expert on child abuse issues, was one of those ordered off the defense witness list.
Most people know it's very infrequent that somebody gets to observe someone being sexually abused.
Hostile or rejecting treatment, shaming, ridiculing.
Hart, who testified in the first trial, interviewed more than 100 teachers, relatives, and friends of the Menendez family. He says he came to believe the brothers' story of incest because he found more than 75 incidents of physical and emotional abuse and its telltale signs that could be corroborated.